How would you feel if high gas prices weren't just a temporary annoyance, but a new reality? Well, due to the war in Ukraine, sky-high prices at the pump may be the new normal. Keep watching to see how else the war could fundamentally alter the world. Despite a number of so-called proxy wars fought around the globe, since the close of World War II, the world has been a relatively stable place. These proxy conflicts, including the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, to name a few, pitted armies or militant groups aligned with America against combatants aligned with the USSR. Additionally, all wars fought during these Cold War years were carefully contained both in terms of geography and scope. Why the containment? Because a larger war could have brought the larger NATO alliance into direct conflict with the Eastern Bloc and allies of the USSR, leading to a global conflict. During the Cold War and even after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, a balance remained in place in which the richer, better-armed nations of the world tacitly agreed not to directly fight with one another. Beyond that, these nations also agreed to not get overly involved with the politics, economics, and societal functioning of nations near the orbit of their adversaries. That has all changed now. When Russia invaded Ukraine without cause or justification, it breached the practice of restraint that had largely ensured peace in the modern world. One major outcome of Russia's action may be a resurgence of martial will among European nations. No longer content to merely decry unjust actions, these nations and others are providing direct material support to Ukraine and loudly restating their devotion to the NATO alliance, a coalition Russian President Vladimir Putin counted on as being weak, not resilient.
NATO solidarity remains the essence of our alliance.
Even after this war ends, a newly energized Europe may remain, and an America ready to reassert its place on the global stage may stand back up.
America is back.
According to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, in terms of economics, the word inflation means a general rise in the price of goods and services. The most common causes of inflation are consumer demand outpacing supply for the wanted goods, which leads suppliers and retailers to elevate prices in response. But what causes this shortage of the supply of wanted goods and leads to inflation, such as the 40-year high inflation rate of 7.9% we're seeing right now? There are many factors, as is always the case with large-scale economic issues, be they inflation, recession, or even the rarer boom times. One thing still very much at play is the global COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic seems to be nearing its end in many ways, but has still wreaked havoc on production and supply of all manner of goods in recent years, according to data sourced directly from the White House. Another reason for current inflation is, of course, the war in Ukraine. According to the views of economic experts related via the Wall Street Journal, this conflict that has already sent gas prices soaring is also likely to increase the price of commodities like grain, cooking oils, metals, and more, and prices are unlikely to simply fall again once the guns fall silent. If past wars provide precedent, inflation caused by the war in Ukraine will remain high for years to come. And seeing as it was already an issue based on the pandemic, prices may be permanently altered in some places. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is a group of countries predominantly from Western Europe and North America that banded together during the Cold War as a bulwark against potential Soviet aggression. The cornerstone of the NATO Charter is an agreement that any attack by any foreign adversary against any NATO member will be treated as an attack on all members. That agreement has stayed in place even after the end of the Cold War that spawned the group, and it has remained, in theory, a powerful deterrent against aggression. Here's how it works. If Russia were to attack, say, France, all NATO members would respond as if their nation had been directly attacked. The same would be the case were, say, Brazil to attack Canada, or South Africa to invade Spain, and so on. In recent years, NATO has often seemed more of a treaty on paper than a group of militaries genuinely poised to act as one. And it seems Russia's Vladimir Putin made a gamble on this being the case, a gamble he is losing.
And Putin is paying a big price for his aggression.
Rather than revealing itself as a paper tiger, NATO is proving to be a proud, robust alliance. According to a briefing issued by the Atlantic Council, NATO members have rededicated themselves to defending every inch of NATO territory against any attack or invasion. Doubling down on this generally held position, British Health Minister Sajid Javid recently said, "A single Russian toe cap on NATO territory would be considered an act of war." Furthermore, nations previously hesitant to join NATO, such as Sweden and Finland, are considering applying for membership. According to data assembled by the BBC, as of March 2022, nearly 3 million people have fled Ukraine as war ravages the country. That means that almost 7% of all Ukrainians have left their homeland, based on the World Bank's population estimate of the country, which was 44.13 million people prior to the ongoing conflict. And based on the precedent set by far too many conflicts we have seen before, there is a good chance that a large number of Ukrainians who have fled their homeland as the Russians invade will never again call Ukraine home. That's because a notable percentage of war refugees never live in their homeland again, according to studies conducted by the Immigration Policy Lab. Most Ukrainian refugees today are in Poland, though Hungary, Slovakia, Moldova, and Romania have taken on many as well. And many refugees are pushing on further, headed to Germany or France or even to the UK. So the further they get from home, the greater the chance they may not return, especially if the war drags on or proves highly destructive to property and infrastructure in Ukraine. That number of refugees, the nearly 3 million who have left the nation, does not include an additional 1.85 million people who are internally displaced, which means they are still in Ukraine but have nonetheless been driven from their homes. With those numbers added to the total, over an astonishing 10% of all Ukrainians have been displaced so far. Russian President Vladimir Putin has been in charge of his nation since the most recent turn of the century. Appointed prime minister and then made interim president in late 1999 by Boris Yeltsin, Putin has served as the president of the Russian Federation for almost 2 decades. Putin had another stint as prime minister in between terms in office, during which his crony Dmitry Medvedev held the office of the presidency, keeping it warm for Putin as the autocrat kept up the appearances of democratic rule. Thanks to a rule change jammed through during his current 6-year term as president, Putin looks set to hold the presidency until the year 2036, which would mean he would have ruled over Russia for more than 3.5 decades. And up until recently, it looked like an almost foregone conclusion that Putin would remain in power atop Russia for that long, barring an unforeseen illness, accident, or perhaps an assassination. In other words, no one inside Russia was going to take this man down. But Putin may well have ruined his own prospects for another dozen-plus years of power based on his rash, violent invasion of neighboring Ukraine. By forcing this war upon Ukraine, Putin may have finally revealed himself as an unstable leader who cannot be trusted, potentially even by those who have long benefited by staying in his orbit. Putin may face a backlash at home that eventually forces him from power, and that backlash could come from protests in the streets, rancor on social media, or even mutiny in the halls of the Kremlin. In many parts of the world, the days of the gasoline-powered automobile are already numbered. For example, last year the Biden White House set out a goal for just over half of all new vehicles to be sold in America to be electric by the year 2030. In Europe, recent goals were set to entirely curtail greenhouse gas emissions from passenger vehicles by the year 2035, with electric vehicles replacing fossil fuel-powered autos. But for now, most of the world's vehicles still run on gasoline, and that gas has gotten significantly more expensive in the first half of 2022. In fact, according to data cited by the New York Post, gas prices have been sent to record highs because of the Russian war of aggression in Ukraine. And according to that same New York Post reporting, prices are unlikely to come down by any appreciable amount for many months. According to AAA's reporting on national average gas prices, in March of 2022, the national average price of a gallon of gas in America was $4.31 for regular unleaded fuel. The highest per gallon average price for a state was $5.75 in California, while the lowest was $3.81 in Kansas.
It's $180 a full tank.
The term Iron Curtain was first used to describe the intangible but certain dividing line between the USSR and the West by former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill during a speech made on March 5, 1946.
An iron curtain has descended across the continent.
Churchill was speaking to an audience gathered at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, having come to that Midwestern locale at the invitation of American President Harry Truman. The term Churchill coined in that speech would go on to largely define Western-Soviet relations for the next 45 years, until the breakup of the USSR in the 1990s. Though the Soviet Union is no more, it is seemingly more and more likely that the old dividing lines between Russia and the Western world are being drawn ever more clearly. After all, Vladimir Putin seems almost intent on establishing a new Iron Curtain type of relationship between Russia and its allies, and the Western nations at odds with Russian ascendants. This desire for a defined and powerful sphere of influence was, in fact, one of Putin's major reasons for invading Ukraine. By weakening or even subverting his nation's neighbor, Putin sought to create a buffer state between Russia and the NATO nations to the west. However, Putin badly miscalculated what it would take to weaken Ukraine, and instead of shoring up an intangible wall, he has poked very tangible holes in the security and stability of his own homeland. Nuclear weapons have been used a sum total of twice in all of human history, on August 6th and August 9th, 1945, and both times they were deployed by the United States against Imperial Japan. The fact that no nuclear bomb has been used since is a testament to just how awfully destructive these weapons are. For all the many decades of the Cold War, that awful power was kept at bay largely thanks to the fact that both sides in said war were well armed with nukes, and no one really wanted to go the whole mutually assured destruction route. The Cold War may have ended in principle, but the nuclear weapons so so often associated with it never went away. According to the Arms Control Association, there are currently 9 nations with nuclear weapons, the total of which is around 9,600 weapons in a state ready to be used militarily. Far and away, the majority of these nuclear arms are held by Russia, which has some 6,257 nuclear weapons. The United States is a close second with 5,500 nuclear weapons readied. As of March 2022, the West is committed to avoiding direct conflict with Russia, which is of course in Russia's interest as well. But if this war spreads and NATO nations become involved, it's possible, though improbable, that Russia would turn to its most powerful weapons. This would in turn compel a nuclear response, which could very well lead to death and destruction on a scale we just can't fathom.